Hey, Pete here from TechMyStressAway.com. In this video I want to share with you a basic WordPress website security audit that I've created for anyone who has a self-hosted WordPress website. Let's be honest, I know security isn't the most exciting part of having a website, and the reality is security for a lot of people is generally low on the priority list until something bad happens. That being said, you do have a responsibility to your visitors that your website is safe, particularly if you're storing their personal information. For example, if your website is an e-commerce store or a membership site, you must do everything you can to protect your customers' data. Hopefully this video and the checklist will act as a starting point to help you identify some key areas for securing your WordPress website. If you want to download the checklist, you can visit techmystressaway.com/sec. Now, before we talk through the checklist, I want to make a couple of things clear. First, this is a basic and general audit for you to use as a foundation. There's no one size fits all when it comes to WordPress security. The second point, the only way for a website to be 100% secure is to not have a website at all. Now I'm assuming as you're watching this video that isn't an option, so the best thing to do is just try to secure it as much as you can. On the screen is the checklist that we're going to be walking through for the rest of the video. Now, the first section is the introduction, just a few notes. I'm going to cover this as we're kind of going through the video anyway. Here will be a link to the video you're watching now, so you can use it as a reference, and obviously you can just quickly access the video should you need it. The first bit is for a website address. Now, if you print this out and if you want to keep it for your records, and if you have more than one website, you can put your website address there and the date that the audit was performed. Now, I would suggest probably doing this on a monthly basis. Some of the points won't need to be done every single month, but most of the points are worth going through. The first section is to do with user accounts, and we're going to look at cPanel hosting. So most people will be probably using some form of cPanel on their hosting account. cPanel is just a type of control panel when you log into your hosting account. What we can see here as well is a link which will take you to more notes on each section. So if we click that link, you'll see here it'll take us to some relevant notes on each section, and if we want to go back to the checklist, we can just click on return to checklist and that'll take us back. The first thing is strong password. You should be using strong passwords on all your accounts. This is not just a hosting or a WordPress thing. You should be doing that for every account that you have. I'd say 12 characters minimum and a mixture of uppercase, lowercase letters, numbers and symbols. You can use a password manager to generate strong passwords for you, and also obviously manage the passwords themselves. The next one is we want unique passwords. This is again for every online account that you have. You should be using a unique password. If your information is involved in a data breach somewhere and a malicious hacker gets hold of the password, if you're the type of person that uses the same password on all different accounts, they could quite easily try some of the common accounts and see if they can access multiple accounts. So just something to be aware of. The next one is to check if your password is on Have I Been Pwned breach list. Now, there is a video where I talk about Have I Been Pwned, which you can see in the notes. And it also talks about LastPass, which is the password manager that I use. If we go over to the Have I Been Pwned website, we'll see here there's a password section. So if I just type in password as an example, because obviously that's going to be used somewhere, as we can see 3 million plus times it's been seen in different data breaches, and it gives you some information here on why it's important to have unique passwords to do with credential stuffing. So you can have a look through that if you want, but what you want to do is the password that you use for cPanel, just make sure that it's not on a known list. If it is, then I'd suggest changing it. Now, if we go back, we'll see the next section talks about your WordPress account. So this is the account you use to log in to the WordPress dashboard or the admin area. We can see here, before I go through kind of these steps here, we'll see we've got unique and strong passwords again, and that we can check the admin password on the Have I Been Pwned breach list. What you can also do is check your email address. So if we go back to the Have I Been Pwned website and go here, and I'll type in a test@test.com. Now it's important to note here that it's not saying that your actual email address has been breached, or your actual email account, should I say. It's saying that your email address was in the data that was breached. So if we look down here, it will have a list of the breaches that it was involved in. So this will tell you if you had an account with these particular companies that was breached, and it'll tell you a bit more information, so it's worth having a look through that. So that's just something that you can kind of check. Now if we go back up to here, we want to make sure that on your WordPress site there's no unnecessary accounts. So this is probably more for people where you've paid someone to create a website for you. It's just worth checking that that they no longer have access. Obviously if it's going to be an ongoing relationship, so they're continually looking after your website, then they'll need an account. But if they've kind of built it and just handed it over to you, you don't want to be giving access when it's not necessary. So I'd suggest deleting those accounts. If you have staff, if ex-employees or anything like that, then obviously they no longer need accounts, and you just want to protect yourself to make sure that you're just not giving any unnecessary access. The next one is the admin account is only being used for admin tasks. Something I see quite a lot, especially websites where it's just run by one person, is that there'll just be one account on there, and it will be an admin account, and they'll use that for everything. So it'll be done for obviously keeping the website updated, but it'll also be used for posting content. Now that's not a good thing, because WordPress by design doesn't hide usernames. There's a video where I talk about brute forcing attacks again, which will be linked in the notes further down. You can check that out, but we want to really just be using a admin account purely for admin tasks, and then for publishing content you probably want to use maybe like an editor level. There is a link that goes through different roles of WordPress again further down, so you can check that out. And the last bit of the WordPress account section is this: is anyone can register disabled? That should probably say unchecked, but I'll show you this option now. If we go into the test site that I've got, and if we go to settings, we'll see this option next to membership, anyone can register. Now basically what this is that someone can register as a subscriber to your blog. So this really was a function for bloggers, so people could register and maybe comment or subscribe kind of to get updates about the blog. It's that kind of option. So we want to make sure if you don't use this that it is unchecked. Now if you have a membership website, this is nothing to do with that. If you use a membership plugin, that will control people registering for the site, so you don't need to worry about this being ticked for that kind of function. Generally I'd say most people will have this, should have this unchecked, because there are vulnerabilities that can happen where a malicious hacker only needs a subscriber level account, and then what they do is called privilege escalation, which then will give them the rights of an admin. My advice would be to leave this unchecked unless there's definitely a reason you need to leave it checked. So if we go back to the checklist and move to the next section, the next section is about your web hosting account. Some of this stuff will not apply to everyone. It really depends on the type of hosting you've got. First part is to do with FTP and file checks. Now every hosting account should have FTP. This is the process where you can upload files from your computer to your hosting account. Now if someone built your site, they may have created an FTP account, so it's always worth checking to see what accounts are in place. If we go back to cPanel, and we'll see here under files we've got this FTP account, so you can go in there and see what FTP accounts are on your hosting. Now really you should only have one for the domain. If you have multiple domains, you may have multiple FTP accounts for each domain. There may be a special type accounts where, for example, something like an anonymous account. Now you really want to have that disabled. Most of the time I've seen this is disabled by default, so you don't want anonymous to be enabled, because that basically means that anyone can kind of connect to your hosting account. They have limited access, but still I would still suggest you don't want to have that enabled. Next, we've got all directory or folder permissions are set to 755 and all file permissions are set to 644. If we go back to the hosting, we'll see here, if we go into File Manager, this will show you a list of all the files on your hosting account. So for this particular site, we can see that the permissions under this column here set to 755 for folders. So generally you'll have an icon like this representing folders, and then files, depending on the type of file, will have different icons like this, and they should be set to 644. So that's always worth checking. Now if we go back and we see here, there are a couple of files that I set special permissions for, and the first one is the .htaccess file. Depending on what your web server software is used for your hosting account, generally it's Apache, that's the most common one. They use this .htaccess file. This contains instructions for the web server. Now it's not important you understand really what these files do, it's just more from a permission and what they're set to. The WP config file is the main configuration file for WordPress, so all WordPress sites will have this file. So let's go back to our file manager and we'll see this .htaccess file here. Now to change permissions, you can usually right click and then click on change permissions, and we'll see here we've got different columns. Now I'm not going to go into what permissions are, you can check this out if you're interested, but basically we want to set it to 444 for the .htaccess file. So if we uncheck this right option underneath the user column, this basically means that none of these groups can have write access. So this just adds a little bit more security to actually write into the file. Now what you may find is that there may be some plugins that need access or want to update the htaccess file, including WordPress itself. So if you change your link structure, what's known as permalinks, it needs to write to the htaccess file. If you're ever in that situation where something is saying that the htaccess file is not writable, all you need to do is go back in here, click on this here to set this to 6, and then it'll be able to do whatever it needs to do. Then you can come back in and uncheck it again and set it back to 444. So that's just a side note. If we go down to the WP config file, we'll see this here. Actually, before I move on to that, one thing I did want to mention as well is that if you can't see this .htaccess file, this is what's known as a hidden file. So in your hosting, if your hosting is using Apache, like I said, if it's not, you won't have this file. It'll be another type of file, but generally it is Apache. So if you can't see this file, then sometimes you'll have, like on a standard C panel, you'll have like a cog somewhere up here where you can click on it and it'll give you an option to show hidden files. This is a SiteGround account, so they do things a little bit differently. You actually check that option when you first kind of come in to the control panel. Now that's just an extra bit of note if you don't see this file, like I said. Now back to the WP config file. This one here I tend to set more strict instructions because this file contains login information for your database and all different things, so we really want to protect this file. So if I change the permissions for this one, what we want this one to be is 400. So we're going to uncheck user for the right permissions again, but we're also going to uncheck the read permissions for group and world. And we'll see here it sets it to 400. Click change permissions, and then if we look over here, we'll see it's set to 400. So they're just two specific files that I set permissions for. The next one is check that no sensitive files are publicly accessible. So what you may not know is that a lot of files can be directly accessed by anyone. So this tends to be to do with what permissions are set to again, but we want to make sure that we're not putting any kind of sensitive files on your hosting account. So as an example, I've put a couple of files on here, so we can see I've done a password.txt. Now this is just obviously a daft example. We don't want to be storing like a text file with passwords on or logins or anything like that. And we've got another one here that says financials.xls. So it's a spreadsheet where some people may want to use kind of their hosting account as a storage thing. So this is just, I want to show you that some files can be directly accessed. So if we go to the site, and if I go to the home page, and if I type in here /password.txt, we'll see here. Now obviously, like I said, it's a bit of a joke, but it just shows that the text files can be directly accessed. And then if I go to this spreadsheet one, we'll type in financials.xls. We'll see here, this gives me the option now that I can kind of save this file, so I can download it. Now there's lots of different files, obviously, like PDFs, Word documents, so any kind of file like that format. Zip files, which are compressed, which is a file that contains compressed files, so like your backup files. This is why you shouldn't keep backup files, because they can be directly accessed. So you want to make sure, if there are sensitive files and you understand how this kind of works, that they are protected in some way. So that's just a note on that. The next thing is we want to check that the directory listing is off. So what can happen, a good way to kind of test this is, again, if we go back to the browser and if we type in WP content /uploads, whenever you kind of try to directly access like a folder or a file or whatever, then you should get this 403 forbidden error, or you may just get like a white screen. Basically, we just don't want people to be able to see the directory structure. If this wasn't the case for this here, you would get a list of all the files in this folder. So it's just something that you kind of want to make sure is turned off, and I'll show you how this is done on this particular setup. If we view this htaccess file, I can show you an example of what this is used for. In this case, we'll see here this options -indexes. This basically turns off directory listing, so this is a way you can use your htaccess file. If you find that when you go to this address here, obviously using your domain name, if you can see a list of files, it means that the directory listing is on. So we want to put this instruction here. Obviously, like I said, it just depends on your setup, so you may have to do some more digging on how that's done. This is another instruction here that can stop a file being viewed. So we'll see here, I'm protecting the php.ini file, which I'm not going to go into, but just so you know, there are options to stop this. Now if we go back to the checklist, we'll see here the last bit is that changes to WordPress files are being monitored. And if we go down to the notes section, we'll see here that there's a couple of plugins that I've linked to where you can check. Now the reason why we want to make sure that we're kind of monitoring the files changes, because it is an indication sometimes where a hacker may have updated a file. Now there are some files that do change, so like log files, or maybe if you're using some kind of caching for your website, them kind of files will update. But generally, unless you actually update WordPress or update a plugin or update a theme, then files shouldn't change. Now it may take you a little while just to kind of find the false positives, but that's what these plugins will help you do, just to keep an eye on files when they're updated. So if we go back up, we'll move on to the next bit, and this is more web hosting checks. So a big part of WordPress, or the way it works, is using PHP code, and a lot of the files you'll see on WordPress are PHP files. What you want to be doing, and I've done a video which again is linked in the notes section regarding how to check PHP and what version you're using and how to update it and that kind of thing. Now PHP versions don't tend to change that often, and it will depend on your hosting on whether they've got the latest version available, but you want to be using at least the latest version that they're offering, and it should be at least PHP version 7. So if I go back to the WordPress site, and since I did the PHP video, the site health check tools is now all integrated. So what you can do is, if you go into tools, site health, and then if we go into info, you can check inside WordPress what version of PHP your site's using. So if you go into server, on the drop down you'll see here that this is using 7.3, which is the latest version of PHP when this is being recorded. So you want to make sure that you are using the latest version that at least your hosting provider offers. If we go back into status, you would get a notification that would tell you that you're using an older version of PHP if that was the case. Now the next thing is site uptime being monitored? Now this isn't particularly a security measure, but it's always worth knowing if your website goes down. So if it's not accessible, obviously it'll keep an eye on your hosting provider to make sure that they are keeping your website up, but it can also be a indication that maybe the website's been hacked and it's gone down for some reason. So it's always worth knowing when the website goes down. The next bit is the raw access logs. Are they being archived? If we go to the cPanel again, we'll see this here under visitor stats, raw access logs, and we can see here that we've got a couple of options when it comes to configuring it. Now this here will archive the logs in the home directory at the end of every 24 hours, it says here, so you want to make sure that's ticked. If you've got a lot of sites like we do on this particular hosting account, you may want to remove the previous month's archive logs because it can get messy really quickly and there's no kind of way to organize these log files, so it can get pretty messy. But the reason why we want to have these log files is that should your site get hacked, it basically logs all the activity, so you can go through those logs if you kind of understand what they mean. But if not, if you get someone else to look at them, then it's going to be useful information for them to find out how the website was compromised and what kind of activity the malicious hacker was doing. So that's always worth having enabled. Now the next thing is an SSL certificate installed for the website. So I'm not going to go into this too much, but basically an SSL means that your website uses HTTPS, which is a secure version of HTTP. It basically encrypts the information between the server and the visitor. So it just means that if someone kind of gets the information in between, they'd have to decrypt it before they could actually see anything, so any personal information. So you definitely should have HTTPS by now. Most hosting companies do offer the free Let's Encrypt, and there is a link for someone else's video. This isn't my video, further down again in the notes section, which is an old video, but it's still very relevant just to kind of talk more about this here. So I thought that might be useful for you. If you do know that you've got an SSL and WordPress is using HTTPS, it's always worth making sure that it's actually being used by WordPress. So if we go into the settings again, your WordPress address and site address should be using HTTPS, so that just makes sure that WordPress is actually using HTTPS, and that should handle everything else. Now the next thing is we want to make sure that if you are using HTTPS, that HTTP is not accessible, and the easy way of doing this is if I just copy this here, and then if I open a incognito window and paste it in, if I just type in HTTP, I should automatically, which I am, being redirected to the HTTPS version. So you just want to do that check, make sure that it is automatically redirecting if someone does come in using just HTTP. Now the last bit here is to check for mixed content issues. Sometimes what can be a problem is that someone may link to an image, which is one of the most common ways that I've seen that mixed content issues happen. So if we go back to the website. I'll show an example where I've done this and what it kind of looks like. So if we go to blog, if we click on this post here, we'll see up here, this basically means that the HTTPS, there's something on the web page that's not using HTTPS, and it's actually this image here. So what you can do is, if you ever get this on your website, if you're using Chrome or Firefox, you can use the developer tools. So if you just click on inspect and then go to console, you'll see here that it's telling you that you've got mixed content, and it's telling us it's because of this image is linked to HTTP instead of HTTPS. So that's a way of doing it. There are plugins that basically enforce mixed content, so it enforces HTTPS. So if this is a problem for you, it's something you can look into. So the last section is to do with WordPress itself. The first point is WordPress core up to date. Now, a big part of keeping WordPress secure is by performing updates regularly. So that's the core software, plugins and themes. If we go to the test site, we can see here we're on the WordPress updates page. This tells us if any updates are available. You can access that. If there are updates, you'll have this here, and then under the dashboard you'll have updates with the number, how many updates there are. So in this case there's 4 updates. We can see WordPress core is up to date. Plugins, there's 3 plugins, and then there's 1 theme that needs an update. So it's very important that you keep everything up to date. So if there was an update for core, then you'll see it here. So we want to make sure that that's kept up to date. I'd say check at least on a weekly basis for updates. There is a video that I've linked to further down that I did to do with safely checking updates, which is done by staging. You can check that out, and that's a way of testing updates before you actually update your live site, because obviously that can be a point where websites break, is when updates are performed, because there's some significant changes in the structure of the website. So it's always worth, if you're not technically comfortable, that you kind of test updates before you actually perform them, because obviously if you don't have the knowledge to be able to fix it or roll it back, then you can be in a bad situation. So it's always worth testing that. The next one is there any backup processes in place? Again, there's another video where I talk about how to do backups, and I show you a way of doing it completely free, so there's no excuses, and you can back it up to Dropbox and store it there. So again, backups are extremely important. If your site is hacked, then you want a quick way to be able to restore your website before it was hacked, and backups give you that opportunity. Also as well, if your site breaks, again, backups can come in handy. Definitely something that you should be doing. The next one is, are the SALT security keys present in WP config file? Now if we go to the C panel, into the file manager again, if we go to the WP config file, which we talked about before, and if I view it, what we're looking for is this section here, and you'll see authentication, unique keys and salts. You should have something similar to this if it's in place. If it's not, then you'll have some default text in place here, and then what you can do is you can actually visit this URL, and you'll see here it actually generates it for you, so you can copy and paste that. I generally just refresh it a couple of times before I copy it, and then you can just copy it and obviously edit your file and put that in. So that's just if your salts are not in place. The next thing is, does the admin login page have any protection? So this could be like a captcha, or maybe even moving the login page. Now this is quite often seen as security through obscurity, but my point of view is sometimes if you just make things a little bit more difficult, it will stop some people. Obviously anyone that's really knows what they're doing, or they're really out to kind of hack your website, then these kind of things are not really going to do a lot. The next thing is a web application firewall, which again is quite an important thing to have. there are some plugins. I've done a video to do with the plugin that I like, the firewall plugin that I like, which is Ninja Firewall. There are some paid options that you can do, or maybe use something like Cloudflare or something like that. So just make sure that you've got something that's analysing the traffic that's coming to your website before it actually hits your website. And that's what a web application firewall will do. It'll get rid of the malicious traffic. And then we've got any brute force protection implemented. Again, a good security firewall or security plugins will offer brute force protection, and basically what that does is it will stops people being able to just continuously try different combinations of logins. That's what brute force is. It's just an automated way of trying lots of different usernames and passwords to try and find the correct one. Now that would be very difficult if you have a strong password, as I recommended, but just so you know, it can also be a drain on resources, so brute force protection can help with that. The next bit is the WordPress plugins. Similar to the WordPress core, we want to make sure that all plugins are up to date. And the next bit is if you're using any kind of pro plugins, especially again if someone's built the website for you, there's a chance that they may have used some kind of pro version of plugins, and that basically means paid versions of plugins instead of just the free ones that are on the WordPress directory. We want to make sure that they're still receiving updates, so that the license is still being paid. So that's something that is going to be an individual thing you need to check to see if you're using any of these things. It's something I see all the time where someone's built a website for someone else and they've used a pro version of a plugin, but it's no longer getting updates because the license has not been renewed. So definitely something to check for. The next thing is, are all the plugins still being maintained? Now, the way we can do that, if you're using a plugin that's free and on the WordPress directory, so if I go to the plugins page, we can see here, if it should have this link here saying view details, and if we click that, it'll bring up a pop-up of the information that's held on the WordPress directory. So in this case here, Elementor, we can see, was last updated 3 weeks ago. I would suggest, definitely if something's not been updated for 6 months, I would do some more digging just to see if it is still supported. And what you can do is, if we go to it doesn't show here the support, but if we go to the plugin page on the WordPress.org website, we'll see we've got this support tab. So another indication is that if people are asking questions or have any issues, just make sure that the developer is answering the questions, and this can tell you specifically, like if there's been no response for months, then it's another indication for me that it's no longer being supported, and that's really not good. So you really want to try and find, if you do have any plugins that are no longer supported, you need to try and, if you don't use it, obviously delete it. If you need that function, then you're going to have to try and find something to replace it. Now, this is a similar again. Is there any inactive or unnecessary plugins? So just make sure that any plugins that are on your website, if they're not being used, delete them, because this just increases the attack surface. That's what it's known as for malicious hackers. So it's just one more area for them to try and find a way into the website. So anything that's inactive or unnecessary, get rid of. And the last thing here is that any of the plugins installed with known vulnerabilities. A good place to check for known vulnerabilities is the WP Vuln database. So it's a vulnerability database, and that's wpvulndb.com. Again, there's a link in the document to this website, and you can basically just go through. If we go onto the plugins page and just go through all the plugin names, just to make sure that you're not using a version that's vulnerable. Obviously, like I said, we want to make sure everything's up to date, but it's always worth just checking. So for example, if I grab the Ocean Extra, and if I just paste that into the search box and click search, we'll see here they've got one vulnerability in their database, which was for 1.5.8 and below. and if we click on it, it will just give us some more information about the vulnerability, also maybe some references on who found it and disclosed the vulnerability. So very interesting site if you're really into security, but it's definitely worth checking through the plugins that you've got installed, particularly if they're not all up to date. So definitely worth checking out. And the last section to check is the WordPress themes. Very similar to plugins, we want to make sure that your active theme is up to date. If you're using a pro theme, you want to make sure that it's still receiving updates. Again, this is a common thing where a developer will use a pro or premium version of a theme, and then it won't be getting updates because the license will not be renewed, so you need to make sure you check that. You want to check that the active theme is being maintained. Now this is slightly different than plugins. If we go here, we can easily check the version and when it was last updated, like I showed you before. Whereas with themes, if we go to appearance, there's no link, so they don't have the same kind of thing. So what you may need to do is, for example, if we go and copy the theme name, if you go to the WordPress.org website, and then if you click on themes, and then in the search box hit enter, and then click on more info. If it finds your theme, this will tell you when it was last updated, so the same kind of information, but you actually have to get that from the WordPress.org website. If yours is a paid theme, you're probably going to have to Google and find the actual website where it was bought from. Now obviously if you've done it yourself, you'll know that already, but if someone else did it, you'll probably have to do a bit of digging to find out where it comes from and see what version and licensing information, etc. Now next bit is if it's still being maintained. Again, same kind of thing on there, just check to make sure when the last time it was updated. Check for comments on support to see if they're being answered, any questions and that kind of thing, so just to make sure the support's there. Now we've got any inactive or unnecessary themes installed. If we go back to the site, we'll see here I've got a few different ones. Ideally we just want the actual active theme, which will be noted as active there. Now you may want to keep the latest theme, the latest WordPress default theme, which in this case is 2020, so you can switch if you do have a problem with your website where the theme needs investigating. But I would suggest probably just keeping the actual active theme. One thing to be aware of is if someone created the site for you again, to make sure that if they're using a child theme, you'll have like two versions of the theme. So you'll have the actual main theme and then you'll have a child one, which is basically their customizations. So you want to just make sure that you don't delete what's known as the parent theme. So for example, it could be Ocean WP would be here, and then there'd be a child of Ocean WP, so you need to make sure both of them are in place. So that's just a note really. Be careful if you are deleting themes, if you don't really understand the structure of your site. You may need to get some advice from someone just in case. And the same thing again here, any known vulnerabilities, we can check the WP vulnerability database. Same thing, you just type in just paste in the theme name and check it. And the last bit here is just a couple of extra points that I've covered. Now, because you're obviously going to be looking after your own website, one thing you do need to be aware of, that some vulnerabilities will need some kind of input from a site admin. So you may be targeted for malicious links where they will link to some kind of malicious code where it will take advantage of a vulnerability that they've found. So just be very aware when you clicking any links, like if you get any comments, in your WordPress site, on your blog posts, if you get any comments there, or when you receive emails, just be extra vigilant, because social engineering is a growing threat. So, and as it says there, human element of security is often the weakest link. So you are usually the weakest link in security. So just be a little bit more on guard when you're clicking on links. The last bit here is that if you have got more than one website on your hosting account, you do need to make sure that you're maintaining all of them. It's something I see quite often again, is that someone may have a couple of sites. One would just be an old project where they were maybe just playing around with WordPress, or an old site where they had an idea and they kind of just left it. You do need to make sure that if there's them kind of websites on your hosting, you need to either delete them if they're definitely not going to be used. If it's kind of on the back burner and you are going to use it going forward, then make sure that is kept up to date, just like your main site. So just again, just another note just to be aware of. And that's basically it. So I hope you found this video useful. Again, if you want to download this report, go to techmystressaway.com/sec. There should be a link below the video somewhere, depending on where you're watching this. If you do have any comments or feedback, feel free to let me know. And I'll see you next time.